Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happy PharmD podcast. I'm Dr. Alex Barker, founder and CEO of the Happy PharmD, where we help pharmacists get jobs they love. Today, I'm joined by one of my oldest, goodest of all entrepreneur pharmacy friends, Tim Ulbrich. He and I met in 2017, back when I started the Happy PharmD, and that was when I believe you started Your Financial Pharmacists.
Yep.
Before that, it was 2015, 2016.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. And he was working on his book, Seven Figure Pharmacist. Since then, I mean, your financial pharmacist has exploded. You have left your job. You're now working full time as co-founder and CEO. How does it feel?
It's great, Alex. You know, it's been a fun journey, and I was thinking about our conversations not too long ago. Back in 2017, I was still in an academic position at that time. Actually, would remain in an academic position for another 3-4 years after that, while we were growing YFP. So it's been an amazing journey, I think, as we continue towards this mission of helping pharmacists achieve financial freedom. You help pharmacists find the jobs they love. We help pharmacists make sure they're living the rich life that they can and should live, and they have the financial plan to support it. And I've always said to our team, and I mean it sincerely, that I think even just hearing one story, which I'm grateful to hear many, on a week or a month or throughout the year, one story of, hey, I listened to a podcast or I read a blog or I engaged with the planning team. And because of that, this happened, right? That might be accelerating a financial goal. It might be paying off some debt. It might be creating a business or a side hustle that the financial plan was a barrier to doing that before. It might be something simple like getting an emergency fund or buying a home. Any one of those success stories is just, it's so rich in terms of, how we're investing our time and to really see the transformation that's happening. So don't get me wrong, business has challenges, right? You know that all too well.
Yeah.
I'm not here to present everything's rosy. There's exciting times and challenges that come with growing a business, but it's been an incredible journey.
We could talk about that ad nauseum, but that's for off air. For this episode, what I'd love to focus on with you is the current economic conditions. So it's beginning of the year 2023. Recession seems to be all the doom and gloom in the media. And how do we balance, our fears, our worries, and our concerns while having a good financial plan in place?
Yeah.
I mean, not just for our finances, but so that we can, do our work and not really worry about things.
Yeah.
Before I hit the record button, you were talking about this concept of being so afraid of finances and what's happening. And I have to admit myself, I fell down the rabbit hole probably about 6 months ago, back when on YouTube, what was going viral was all this horrible news in China. And it, doomsday preppish afraid. And I have to admit, I bought a solar powered battery and a solar. I bought all this.
Are you in your bunker right now, or what are you doing? Yeah.
I've got a Michigan basement, so it's good enough. And
Yeah.
I've got a coal room downstairs. But I was legitimately afraid. And I feel like, I mean, that's what goes viral, right? From the media, is playing on our fears, worries, and concerns. And I feel like that's what's happening now.
Yeah, and Alex, you and I both know how strong of an emotion fear is. Arguably the strongest emotion that often either sends us down irrational pathways, or prevents us from leaning into the things that maybe we could or should be leaning into. And I think that is one of the concerns I have right now: is how do we strike this balance between the reality of the economic conditions that we're in, but how do we also zoom out and look at history, look at trends, understand that while the nuances are different, the economic cycles, this is not, unique, perhaps unique to some folks that are listening or experiencing this for the first time. And so we've got to find that balance because, I shared with you before we hit record, early as we started the new year, the first 2 days of the year, we saw the market go down significantly on the first day of trading, and then it went up significantly on the second day. And if you were to get absorbed in any single day of headlines and make decisions off of that, let alone the fear that it ensues and causes, throughout there, that is what I think is concerning with so much attention that is on the market and the economy at large, but also obviously it's a topic of interest right now because of inflation, because of all the things that are going on. So that is real, but the fear can drive us to an irrational place. And so I'm an optimist by nature. I look at a cycle like this to say, hey, when I finished residency in 2009, finished pharmacy school in 2008, I didn't necessarily have a whole lot of assets that I was worried about the market tanking, but we did live this and see some of this firsthand. Again, the situation, the scenario was different. It wasn't that, I saw my nest egg go down, 30 to 40%. It was more hearing from other pharmacist colleagues, parents, grandparents, et cetera. But I think for those that generationally have been through some of this, you'll notice that there's maybe a little bit more of a tempered approach of, hey, the economic conditions are real. We've got to do some things to perhaps tighten up, build some cash reserves, make sure we're thinking strategically about, the future in the next decade or 2 decades ahead. But we also don't want to overreact in this time period, and obviously be thinking that, this is something that we're not going to be able to climb out of. And I know that's scary. If I'm a new grad right now, Alex, I was just talking with a dental hygienist yesterday about this who has a 22-year-old daughter. This is a challenging time to be coming out of school and entering the job market. That is a fact, right? You look at student loan debt and the level that it's at right now. You look at folks that are trying to buy a home and where interest rates are at, or even if you're not trying to buy a home, where rent is at. There's a trickle-down effect there. And then obviously we're dealing with inflation at a place where I know I've never seen in my lifetime. And while pharmacists make a great income, all of those things I just mentioned eat significantly into that income. And so for me, priority number one of a new grad, especially, is we have to level set expectations of, yes, I make a great income, but ... At the end of the day, that income only goes so far. Yeah. And so I've got to kind of step back and say, okay, what's the plan for the student loans? What's the plan for purchasing a home? What's the plan for saving and investing for the future, building up cash reserves? And how do we balance all of these and be able to move forward with building a strong foundation, despite obviously the turmoil and the situation that we're in right now?
And for loans, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the latest class is averaging what, $170,000?
Yeah, good news, bad news, maybe, Alex. We've actually have seen this come down in the
Oh,
last
good.
2 years. Yeah, so we, some historical context on student loans. So 2010 median debt load was about $100,000. We saw that peak. I believe it was around 2020 at 170, and now that's come down. Class of 2022 is at closer to 160 is the median debt load. Now, when I talk on this topic, I say good news, bad news. Good news is it came down. Bad news is it's $160,000. It's that's
Yeah.
still a big number.
The price of a cheap home in an urban area, right?
Yeah, and we've become, numbed over to this over time. As I often share my story, accruing and paying off a couple $100,000 of debt, I can be in a room of 100 or 200 people telling that story, and there's very little emotional reaction to that number because everyone looks around and they're like, yeah, it's pretty normal, right? With what I have or what I'm going to be paying off. So what I think is concerning is that we now, Alex, have 3 graduating classes, 2020, 2021, 2022, that have not been required to pay a penny on their federal student loan debt because of the provisions dating back to the beginning of the pandemic with the CARES Act. So we had a administrative forbearance on student loans that said, hey, there's a freeze on the payments, $0 payment, 0% interest. No better deal than that, right? Hard to argue with that. That was continued several times by the Trump administration, again by the Biden administration. They tried to expand that recently through some debt cancellation. We can talk about that. It's tied up in the courts right now, TBD of what's going to happen. Potentially a new income-driven repayment plan coming out here soon. But one of the blessings of the pandemic, if there have been any, is that, people have been able to allocate their income towards other goals because they're not having to make massive payments toward their student loans. So while there's inflation, while there's high, housing and rent expenses, we've been able to weather that. I think pharmacists a little bit more because they're not making these massive student loan payments. That's been a good thing, or build up some cash reserves or invest. But what is going to happen when we turn those back on, right? And it feels like with now 3 years of no required payments, it feels like we've kind of forgotten about student loans. And I shared with you before we hit record, when we often talk with people about their financial goals, their financial plan prior to the pandemic, the vast majority of folks, student loans was the number one or perhaps number two, number three thing they were working with. It feels like right now, Alex, it feels like there's very little pain around student loans. And that's not because the number has changed much. I think that's because we've essentially forgotten about them over the last 3 years.
Let's put it in context. So if someone is dealing with $160,000 in student loan debt, what would that payment be approximately?
So if they choose the standard default 10-year repayment in the federal system, that's around $1,800 to $1,900 a month over 10 years. Now, a lot of people don't. A lot of people go into a longer time period through like an income-driven repayment plan where, as their income goes up, so does their monthly payment. So it's a more scaled approach. But if someone goes into that fixed 10-year repayment, that's kind of the point I'm making. So if we draw that out a little bit further, Alex, take home, probably average take home pharmacist, obviously depends on where they live in taxes, but it's probably somewhere around like $6,500, $7,000, I would assume. So percentage wise, let's use 2,000 as a round number. We're starting to push 30% of take home pay towards the student loans. And we haven't even talked about what's going on in housing expenses and just general inflation as well. So can pharmacists still be successful with their financial plan given the student loan debt, given the economic conditions? I really think they can. But to the point I made just a few moments ago, we've got to get out of this mindset of I make a six-figure income, so it's all going to be okay. It's not going to be okay if we don't intentionally plan. And I think we can get there. But I know I felt this, Alex, when I was going through school, whether it was said or unsaid, there was kind of this feeling of like, you're going to be making a great income. Don't worry about it. And what I'm trying to really change that narrative, and I think it has changed a little bit over the last few years, is changing the narrative. You make a good income. That's true. But for many pharmacists, that income may be relatively flat. And how we decide to handle our finances in the first 5 to 7 years out of school is going to set the tone for the rest of our careers, because we can't bank on, for many folks, that upward trajectory to kind of take care of that increase in cost of living expenses over time.
Do you think that before the pandemic, it seemed to me like many students were or new grads, were fixated on wanting to pay off all this debt as quickly as possible. Has that gone away now because of the debt delay, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there were several questions we would get early on of like, even though I have $0 payment, 0% interest, should I pay down the debt? And obviously that's a very personal decision. Some people, all debt is bad. It's very emotional. It's painful. I want it gone yesterday. Other people may be a little bit more comfortable with leverage and, okay, if I've got an opportunity to not make any payments, I can allocate this towards other parts of the plan, but I know I'm going to have to address it at a later point in time. I don't know if we can answer that question until we start to see the payments kick back on. Because this reminds me of like when we were in pharmacy school, like we knew that debt was coming sort of, but it wasn't until that first notice came of like, hey, payment is due. How much is due for how many years? Then it got real, right?
Yeah.
I often share that it feels like monopoly money, and then it turns into real money. And I think we've gone back into this monopoly money phase, and it's been an incredible gift again for folks that have been able to allocate and achieve other goals, perhaps start businesses, buy a home, do other things that they wouldn't have been able to do. But I worry, are we planning for this to start back up? And I think for those folks that are listening, whether this starts back up in 3 months after, this works its way through the debt cancellation works its way through the courts, or whether it's 6 months or, whatever happens, it's going to turn back on at some point. And so this is the window of time as you're looking at the financial plan and the goals that you have for the year. How does that piece of the puzzle fit back into the monthly expenses when that does turn back on? And are we planning around that?
I'd assume not for most people. But I also struggle with that idea of monopoly money. I myself feel very much like I never see I don't get a check every month. I don't get a wad of cash from my business every month, right? And
In your
I
bunker, you don't?
right, while I'm sitting in my bunker working on the business. And I have to admit, I recently actually increased our emergency fund, and we have some of that here in our house. And I remember like counting the cash, making sure it was all there, and then putting it in the safe, and thinking like, wow, that's what that amount of money feels like.
Yeah.
And I look at my bank account, which is more than that amount, and I think, wow, this is a lot of play money. This feels like a game. That because I don't touch the money, it doesn't feel real.
Yep.
And it now with the age of my, I tease my mom probably once a month because she's always balancing her checkbook, and she says to me, well, how do you know what do you have if you don't balance it? I'm like, Mom, it's all digital, it's all there, it's in my bank account, it'll tell me what I have. Well,
Yeah.
what if there's a wrong transaction? What if you forgot something? And I go, I say, well, whatever,
Yeah,
it'll
it's
be
there.
fine. I don't think about it. I don't worry about it.
But I think you're making a really good point, Alex, and that is two things that I've observed just personally, and I see this with a lot of folks that we're working with that, maybe cash in hand is not something that we grew up with is, that transfer to the electronic platform. It's a very real thing. Instead of having, money saved up on hand or even, making deposits into the bank. So maybe it's not always staying on hand, but you actually, get the cash and then you're putting it into the account. It feels different.
Yeah.
The other thing is just the reality of the gamification of investing. And that's happening. You look at, Robinhood and Acorns and Betterment and other apps, incredible tools that have the technology has allowed us to, for folks to invest in, has made it, what used to be a very exclusive thing to be very inclusive where many, many people can invest. But also the, kind of the 2-click Amazon approach to investing can also, it has risks, and I think that you get into more of that. If I don't feel as much the income that I've earned or the debt that I owe or whatever you're trying to do, then I think there's that lack of feeling can also transfer to, well, if I invest this and maybe I lose it, like I don't feel the loss at the same level as if that cash came out of my hand.
Yeah.
And I was just talking with my boys about this last week. I was trying to teach them the difference between a credit card and a debit card. And it was really interesting because number one, I was fumbling through the explanations as I'm seeing it through, a 7-year-old's eyes or a 10-year-old's eyes. But it dawned on me, and I've thought this before with them, that they have not ever seen the connection between working and earning an income where that cash comes in directly tied to the work. And then that actually goes into an account where you can save it and grow it and invest it or do whatever. They simply see, like, you go to the store, you buy something, you swipe this little
Uh-huh.
index card, and
Uh-huh.
you get what you need. Like,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it. And so when I started to talk to them about, like, well, debit card, you actually have to have the cash in your account, credit card, you've got a window of time where you can pay it off. And if you don't, interest accrues, and then you start to try to explain interest.
Yeah.
And it was just fascinating because I think without a physical connection to cash, which of course makes sense of why we don't have that, in terms of the advancement in technology and security and being able to grow that money and so forth. But that's a whole nother, area to be thinking about, is just the impact, generationally. Like, I think you and I can still relate. I remember my mom having envelopes in the basement, had cash. I remember seeing her at the bank with a paycheck and interacting with cash. Like, that ain't a thing. And
Yeah.
so, what impact does that have on the next generation, how we teach our kids about money? And obviously, even the folks that are listening now.
There's something visceral and emotional about particularly physical work and the exchange of cash. I know that your sons have a business as well, and I've been pushing my children to do more so work in exchange for cash. And they recently shoveled a bunch of sidewalks,
Mm-hmm.
and um, the old ladies that they picked out to shovel their sidewalks spoiled them rotten, and just gave them way too much money. for the service that they did, the very shoddy shoveling service that they did.
Lesson undermined.
Yeah, but to see to see that look on the face of, wow, I did something in less than an hour and I made like $20.
Yeah, that's right.
And it changes how they saw money.
Yeah.
Um, and and I remember learning about personal finance early on in my career, and I remember almost wishing that my company would my boss would sit me down and then just give me all of the money that I was owed, and then I would feel that accomplishment, right, of what I did, rather than just feeling, oh, there's another paycheck. Yep. All right. Yeah. Same old, same old.
Yeah.
And I think there's even something to be said about being given that money and then physically taking that money and putting it in places, right? Your house bill, taxes,
Yep.
um, and it creates a weight that we don't even think about,
Yeah,
right?
we've
We
skipped
don't have to worry about it.
That's right, direct deposit. I mean, even checks, even checks versus cash, although a step in the direction where we currently are, there still was a physical connection. Direct deposit, obviously, for good reasons. We've kind of gotten away from that altogether. And the more and more it is automated and
Mm.
it's less visceral and we feel less of it and we make the connection less to work and the things we're spending, that's not good, I would say, at large for the consumer.
Yes.
Automation in that sense is typically good for the financial services industry at large. But that's not necessarily, I think, good for the consumer when it comes to intentionality and really being strategic about how we're prioritizing our money and where we're putting it. Because the second you don't feel it, then we tend to lose focus with where we're going and why we're trying to go in that direction.
So play money is fun, right? Bitcoin money is fun to invest in all of that. But, I've got a bunch of cash sitting right now in my bank account, and I'm waiting for the market to drop. I'm waiting for the Great Depression. Is it going to happen, Tim? Can you
You,
say it here first? Are we
you,
going to have another crazy recession?
you know me better than that. I'm not going to predict the markets into the future. I I'm a big fan. We talk about this whether it was 2 years ago when the market was hotter than ever. How soon we have forgotten that we were on a 12 plus year run of the market. That is one that is historic in nature. And now that we've seen, that obviously dip that's begun to happen, there's, good concerns for good reasons of what's going on internationally and with inflation and what the Fed is doing with interest rates. So have we hit the bottom? The closest thing I'll give you to the prediction is I don't think we have, but firsthand, I personally, not saying it's right or wrong if someone else is doing it, I personally am not saving up cash to try to buy the dip that may come, and I don't know necessarily what it would look like.
Bummer.
I'm a firm textbook believer in dollar cost averaging. I have when the market was hot. I'll continue to ride that when the market is low. Personally, 38 years old, I'm looking, long into the future. If I have the blessing to live, long into the future, this is probably going to be one of several dips that we're going to see. And so the roller coaster that is the market, I'm going to kind of steadily buy the market over time. And I'm playing the long play, which is if we look at what the market has done really since the Great Depression, it's been fairly predictable when we zoom out and look at it long term. Now, that is a huge when we statement, right? If we look at it in the moment, it can be insane. We can quickly become irrational in how we behave. And what the literature really shows us is the more we're active and the more we're trying to time the market, what we tend to see is human behavior actually drives us to buy more of the market when the market is high and less of the market when the market is low, which is the opposite of what we would want to be doing. And dollar cost averaging is really an automation strategy to try to take that behavioral pressure out of the equation. So, if the market dips, Alex, significantly, and if I've got a boatload of cash in my bunker, then maybe I'll eat my words and buy the market. Otherwise, I'm kind of staying steady to what's true. I am a little bit kicking myself, to be honest with you, of the dip that we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic,
Yeah.
because I remember thinking in the moment with how quick the Fed was acting, I knew it just felt like in the moment, there's no way this is going to be a long-term economic dip in the market. It's going to be something that obviously the shock of the pandemic is going to hit. There's going to be some significant Fed policy that's enacted, as we saw it was, whether we agree or disagree with, the amount of money that was pumped into the economy. And then we saw the markets kind of resume to where they were. And so if people acted in that dip one way or the other, if they bought in that dip, things were good. If they sold in that dip, just like in 2008, things were not good. So, is there a place for active investing? I think there is for a small percentage of folks that are out there. Although if you look at one of the most successful active investors of all time, Warren Buffett, he would argue that the vast majority of folks shouldn't be doing what he is doing. And so I think for, many pharmacists that are listening that are trying to balance many different things, I really do believe in more of a passive long-term approach.
Always be buying. Steady wins the race. Good to know. But it does seem quite clear that we are walking, if not already in a recession.
Yeah.
And now, economics was always one of those classes that I had such a hard time understanding and getting. If this goes up, then this goes down, and then this goes up as well. And it's a lot of rules, regulations that don't always make sense. But from all of my research into economics and how it influences the job market and job stability, overall, pharmacy seems well protected. Now, I was curious. I know that this is technically, probably, as far as I'm aware, your first recession as a business.
Mm-hmm.
For your clients, what are some of the things that you are doing with them to get them perhaps ready for what could be happening in the marketplace?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question. I think this is where you really have to get into the one-on-one or the individual. How does this affect you and your financial plan, your goals? Whether you're doing that yourself or you're working with someone, and get out of the mass general advice, right? Because Alex, your situation, I'm going to presume I know you're debt free because you shared that journey a long time
Thanks.
ago. Debt free, on student loans, don't have a mortgage. Obviously in more of an opportunistic, point of growing wealth into the future. What you could and should be doing in a recession might be very different than someone who is 27 years old, has $180,000 of student loan debt, doesn't yet own a home, but is itching to own a home, and they're going to buy it at a 6.5-7% interest rate, doesn't have an emergency fund, has a little bit of credit card debt. How you handle the advice to give someone in those two scenarios is very, very different. Right. And so generally speaking, are there some things that we could and should be doing? Sure. You look at a recession or a downward period in the economy, generally speaking, cash reserves are a good thing, to have. But there are often a lot of ways where we can become too conservative in a time period like this. So, you look at examples of things like, Roth IRA accounts or, retirement accounts or saving up in emergency funds or equity in your home. Having cash on hand in something like an emergency fund doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way you can get access to cash if you truly need it, outside of course, borrowing, which would be less than ideal. If folks have a home, there's equity in the home. Do we necessarily want to tap into that equity when interest rates are this high? Probably not, but that's an option. If folks have contributed to Roth IRAs over a period of time, your contributions into the Roth can be pulled from if need be in the event of an emergency without penalty or without taxes, not the growth, but your contribution. So again, this is where I think that folks get in trouble of, New York Times article about the recession and 5 things that we should be doing. That is so different for just you and I, who are probably in a very similar, phase of life and career, versus a new practitioner versus someone who's approaching retirement. The implications of that can be so different.
Tim, as always, this has been an awesome conversation. I always enjoy your perspective on finances because it always levels me up to think differently and think, oh yeah. Stop buying Bitcoin. But some habits are hard to kick.
Sure.
Your website, yourfinancialpharmacist.com, I continually refer to it for our clients, as well as just helping other people understand stuff, even if they're not pharmacists. But I wondered, for those listening, Is there a timely resource or something that you would like to give any of our listeners access to?
Yeah, really, we are weekly putting out new content. Just this week, we're putting out an episode of how to get ready for on the podcast, how to get ready for tax season. We've got some new resources coming out on the blog. So really, to my point about customization, head on over to the website, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. And for pharmacists at all phases of their career, whether they're students, new practitioners, mid-career, pre-retiree, retiree, find the topic and the medium that's of interest and have at it. And we hope it provides some value.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.